in the Eco-Modernist podcast. Our philosophy is based on sound science and free from the outdated dogmas of the 20th century.
Hi, this is Gabe Ignetti.
And this is Eric Schmitz.
And this is the Eco-Modernist podcast. Our world today is faced with enormous challenges moving forward, the most pressing of which is the challenge of moving away from burning things to make power. That task has been made doubly hard as our fears that emanate from the dawn of the atomic age have prevented us from moving to the safest, cleanest, and most effective antidote to our fossil fuel addiction, nuclear power. Speaking with us today on the history and root of these fears is Dr. Spenser R. Weart. Dr. Weart is the director of the Center for History of Physics. He is now a historian of science. He earned his BA in physics at Cornell University and a PhD in physics and astrophysics at the University of Colorado. Dr. Weart is the author of numerous books, including The Rise of Nuclear Fear, which is the subject of this podcast. Dr. Weart, welcome to our show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Could you tell us a little about the books that you have written and give us a brief overview of your book, The Rise of Nuclear Fear?
Well, my two best-known books are The Discovery of Global Warming, which is a history of climate science, The Rise of Nuclear Fear. So the subject of nuclear fear, which I first began working on back in the 1980s, is the way people form images of nuclear energy, or earlier known as atomic energy. And I started because I was working on the Curies back around the end of the 19th century, and I found that many of the feelings that people have about nuclear energy, or atomic energy, it was then known, and radiation, were already present back in the early 20th century. It was surprising to me to see that all of the things that people now associate with are all kinds of magical, mysterious powers, alchemical transformations, health effects, mutations, radioactive monsters. All these were present by the 1930s. The idea of atomic bombs was already talked about in a book by H.G. Wells in 1913. Boris Karloff played a mad scientist who killed people with his radiative powers in the 1930s. So all of the stuff that people now associate with nuclear energy was already present before nuclear energy was actually released, before the actual coming of nuclear bombs and nuclear reactors. So that indicated to me that there were very deep roots to these things, psychological and social roots that go way beyond what the actual effects, the scientific, technological realities of nuclear energy are. And then starting with that back in the early 20th century, I took the story forward to how those ideas came out, got attached into nuclear weapons, nuclear reactors, down to the present time.
The case for relative cleanliness and safety of nuclear power compared to other energy technologies seems to be quite evident. What is it about humans that causes people to turn their backs on the evidence and oppose nuclear power so vehemently?
Well, there's a couple things going on here. One is, as I said, there are many hooks that nuclear energy has into the human subconscious. Things like monsters, because radiation can cause mutations and so forth. But also from very early on, and this was due to the scientists themselves who were excited about it was called magical and mysterious and cosmic. Of course, in actuality, as we now understand, nuclear forces are just another force like electric forces. A coal-fired power plant that's based on chemical things. It's no more mysterious and cosmic and magical than striking a match. But that's not the way people have thought about it for the past century. And when you start talking about monsters and mad scientists and blowing up the world and the end of civilization and atomic war, all of which ideas were present before 1945, then you're talking about very, very deep and powerful psychological things. And then, of course, as scientists said in 1946, it wasn't 10,000 tons of coal that were dropped on Hiroshima. So nuclear energy rapidly became associated with nuclear weapons and with the fear of atomic warfare. Now, this did not affect people immediately in the 1950s as it had been in the 1930s. These ideas that nuclear energy was magical and cosmic also had a very positive idea. There was atoms for peace. The effects of radiation on living creatures could be used to promote health, as in fact, of course, it has done. Many more lives have been saved by radiation than through medicine and have been lost due to it. So there was a lot of positive magic associated with the two. But this began to fade away in the late 1950s and the early 1960s when the number of atomic weapons proliferated, when people began to realize that there were enough bombs in the world to actually end civilization. So that gave rise to an anti-nuclear movement, which was an anti-nuclear weapons movement. And their goal was to end the arms race. And in order to do this, the strategy was to try to end atomic bomb tests. They thought if they stopped testing of nuclear weapons, that would slow down or maybe even stop the arms race. But since they were associated with nuclear weapons and with the very real and immediate fear that we were all going to die in a nuclear war, the anti-nuclear movement was successful only in that the authorities of the world decided to put their atomic bomb tests underground. So there was no more fallout and the whole movement kind of collapsed. But the people who were involved in it that said, well, we said that all this radiation is terrible and harmful, got carried over to nuclear reactors.
The two most powerful and frightening bomb tests that occurred in the 1950s were the American Castle Bravo test and the Russian Zarabomba. How great a role did these events play in stoking nuclear fear?
Well, the Russian test didn't have much of an effect. It was the first Russian test that showed that the Russians had nuclear weapons and showed that they had hydrogen bombs that scared people because they're scared of missiles. The American test was a more interesting case. It was the first test of what would become the hydrogen bomb. It was much more powerful than people expected, and the result was that there was a lot of fallout that went onto nearby islands and onto a Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon. So that was a visible case of fallout from a hydrogen bomb test that made people sick. So it really set off the whole controversy about fallout from bomb tests, not to mention making people more afraid of the fallout from bombs in case of a nuclear war. The controversy over nuclear weapons tests centered on the question of what were the effects of fallout that went around the world. Now, this was a very low level of radiation in most places, except for a few places in the American West. The fallout was only a few percent addition at most to the natural radiation that everybody received. So the question is, what does this mean if you give millions of people, billions of people, a slight increase in the amount of radiation? And there's two possibilities. One is the no threshold, which means all of a sudden you get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of additional cancers. So that's an argument about why you should not have bomb tests in the open atmosphere. And also, incidentally, it's an argument that you have to be extremely careful about waste from nuclear reactors, although people only became worried about that later on. The other possibility is that there is a threshold, and that adding 1% to the amount of natural radiation doesn't do anything. In fact, there's some people who think that it might even be helpful because we evolved to have a certain level of radiation, and maybe radiation stimulates the immune system or who knows what. So the accepted answer came from doctors, and essentially the doctors took the Hippocratic oath, first of all, do no harm. We don't know what adding 1% to the whole human population does. Let's not do it. But then it got extended to the nuclear industry.
What role did irresponsibility and deceit on the part of both the nuclear industry and the government play in stoking public distrust of nuclear power?
The 1950s was an era of father knows best. People tended to accept what the elites said. And the elites also had reasons not to say everything they knew. For, of course, the industry, there was questions of maintaining the usual things of concealing anything that looked bad. Industries always do that. They always try to cover up accidents or problems and try to maintain the best public relations. So do governments. And the American government had the additional thing that there was a Cold War on it, and they didn't want to give any opening to communist propaganda or anything that might affect military readiness. And of course, a lot of the stuff about nuclear radiation was top secret because it did involve weaponry. There was a whole mystique of secrecy. Now, this goes way back because if you go back to 1900, people were talking about the secrets of radiation and the secret power within the atom. Scientists and the media made a big deal about how mysterious and secret was. So you have the whole complex of secrecy, which goes back to the mad scientist with his unhallowed secrets, things that mankind was not meant to know, all that kind of psychological stuff. So the secrecy got combined with the desire to put a good face on it, and people began to recognize that things were going on that they probably should know about and didn't know about. Both the natural distrust of people who keep secrets combined with the actual discoveries that people were not being level with them. For example, the Japanese fishermen were made sick and the U.S. government tried to put the best face on it. There was fallout from open-air bomb tests in the American West, and sheep got sick because they got exposed to fallout, and the U.S. government did their best to cover it up. So as people discovered these cover-ups, they naturally became generally suspicious of the authorities in general, but more specifically of anybody having to do with the mighty nuclear secrets.
I understand, too, that there have been a serious military accident at Hanford, I hear. That was something that a lot of anti-nukers speak about. There seems to have been some cause for concern there.
Well, there were leaks of radiation and so forth from Hanford, as with other places. So that has just contributed tremendously to the general distrust and unwillingness to accept what experts say about the safety or lack of it of nuclear energy.
There was a documentary they had on Netflix called City 40 concerning the city in the Soviet Union that was just devastated with cancer because they just dumped the radioactive materials right into the river.
Chernobyl was only one of their terrible accidents. Of course, we should recognize that the former communist countries were also terrible about all their other pollution. There's not only radiation pollution that has devastated large areas of the Soviet Union, but also chemical pollution from smelters and chemical plants and everything else. Very large areas have been terribly polluted with terrible health effects from non-nuclear industries as well. They just are environmentally a complete mess.
But everybody wants to seem to blame the nukes.
Everybody pays attention to the devastation of nukes and doesn't notice when other areas are equally badly damaged, but they don't rush to evacuate the people.
The speculation about possible dangers of a new technology are not necessarily irrational. Wasn't there at least some plausibility to radiophobia when the anti-nuclear movement first came about?
Yeah, sure. Fallout from bomb tests when it was heavy enough actually did hurt people. And this is carried forward down to the present day, particularly the 3 Mile Island accident, the Chernobyl and the Fukushima accidents. Of course, were genuinely dangerous, but they led to panicky evacuations of millions of people who were frightened. Hundreds of thousands or even millions were displaced as a result of the fear of radiation and the idea that the authorities couldn't be trusted. And they had very real health effects, not from the radiation itself, but because, especially from the Russian case, widespread depression, suicides, alcoholism, and these people displaced from their communities, probably beginning in Japan from the Fukushima thing too. So there are real reasons to worry about nuclear reactors. And you don't like to hear this, but Fukushima was something that would only happen once in 10,000 years. But if you have 500 nuclear reactors, then you expect a Fukushima more or less every 20 years. So you really have to get a once-in-a-million-year event, or you're not going to have people be rationally concerned.
Ever since before the 3 Mile Island accident, the nuclear industry was always saying about how it was just impossible for there to be a nuclear meltdown. And ever since that accident occurred, it seems that was the point where the public just completely lost faith in the nuclear power industry.
That's correct. The nuclear industry also was not as open and transparent as it should have been. Now, it was true that they couldn't blow up like an atomic bomb. As many scientists at the time pointed out, they could melt down and release a lot of radiation. That didn't happen at 3 Mile Island, but it did happen at Chernobyl and Fukushima. So reassurance that both government authorities and industry authorities had given turned out to be false, and that is one of the factors that has led people to mistrust scientific authorities in general. and in the nuclear area in particular.
The first 4 chapters, as you state up front in your book, center on the pre-existing imagery that predisposed us to be fearful of technologies like nuclear power. And you close out chapter 2 by mentioning that progress through science had become the dominant ideology by the late 1930s. Now, the revival of this notion is central to eco-modernism as I understand it, and yet you seem to be setting up for a cautionary tale here. What would you say is the takeaway here for eco-modernism?
Yeah, it has been very difficult. In the 1930s, there were some stirrings of people worried about technology. They thought automation had caused the Great Depression and so on. After Hiroshima, and especially after the spread of nuclear weapons, these worries about technology in general became more widespread, and the environmental movement, and especially the radical leftists in the 1960s and especially in the 1970s, began to associate science and technology with big government and big industry, overweening corporations and so on. And this basically far left worries about rationality seeped over much more recently to the far right, where again we find many people on the right, and in fact even most of the politicians in the Republican Party itself will not say that they believe in evolution and will not say that they accept the consensus on climate change. So feeling that science is elitist, that people are being lied to, has become very pervasive, and it's something that's a great worry. It's a great danger to our civilization, frankly. And as you guys are doing, everybody needs to step back and say, whoa, we do have our civilization based on science, technology, and rationality. Let's not forget that. Eco-modernism, of course, has a lot of different things. So I don't think we can get from the world where we are to the world that we want, which is a world in which there is a reasonable population of people living in reasonable comfort without degrading the natural environment. To get from our present world to that world, we definitely need a lot of science and technology.
Another book that you wrote is The Discovery of Global Warming. How great a threat do you see climate change as being to the planet moving forward?
It's very big, and in fact, one of the reasons that I wrote The Rise of Nuclear Fear was I feel that nuclear reactors, although they undoubtedly have a lot of problems, are necessary because of the contribution they can make to fighting climate change. We can't fight climate change just with solar power. We can't fight it just with conservation. We need everything. We have to throw everything we possibly have into the fight, because climate change is like nuclear war. It's an existential threat to our civilization. If we continue going as we have, even if the nations that have pledged to lower their emissions meet a lot of their goals and so on, we are still on a track where the global temperature will rise to a point where the effects are very likely to be so grave that they will put great stress on democracy, they will put great stress on our industrial system and our economy. There's areas that now are occupied by a couple of billion people may become literally uninhabitable due to sea level rise and heat waves by the middle of the next century. And we just don't know whether civilization as we now have it, a democratic civilization or even an industrial civilization, will be able to survive those stresses, especially given all the other stresses that we're putting the environment under.
Let me ask you this. Do you see the possibility of a real runaway global warming happening?
We don't know what the climate will be like when we get up to 3 degrees above the pre-industrial climate, which is where we now seem almost certain to get. The climate models work very well for present and past climates, but when you get to 3 degrees above, things start to happen that the models can't reproduce very well. So the possibility that it'll run away from there up to 4 or 5 degrees, that is, that once we get to 3 degrees, even if we shut down all our industry altogether, which of course may happen anyway because of the climate will keep getting warmer up to 4 or 5 degrees and essentially wipe out half of the ecosystems of the world, is probably a small probability. But 5%, 10%, are you going to risk a 5% probability that will be knocked back to medieval civilization?
Yeah, and I would say that we really couldn't put a number on that, could we? I just don't know.
But we know that in the past, the world has gone up to a level where the ice caps were melted and dinosaurs roamed what are now polar wastes. We know that that kind of climate is very difficult to model with our present models, where there's stuff going on, maybe giant storms or changes in ocean currents and so on that we don't understand. So we can't really put a probability onto that kind of a runaway. Most experts think that it's not a large probability, but nobody's going to say it can't happen.
What would you say the best case scenario and worst case scenario for the effects of climate change look like moving forward?
They're very far apart, and one reason for this is that we still don't know exactly what the effects of greenhouse gases are. The climate system is very complicated, and there's funny kinds of feedbacks, things that can get set off, vicious cycles or maybe virtuous cycles. So back in 1979, scientists estimated that if you doubled the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the temperature might rise 2 degrees or might rise 4 degrees. We don't know, and we still don't know how much will it rise. And that doesn't depend on the science. That depends on what the world decides to do. And the best case is that all the nations of the world live up to their Paris agreements, which is possible. Even the United States can, simply by municipalities and corporations, the Department of Defense and so on, keep on what they're doing. So if all the nations of the world meet their Paris agreements, and then when they meet again in 5 years, they ratchet up the level, and then they ratchet up again, so that by 2050 we are emitting no greenhouse gases, this is technologically feasible. It will take a very strong, almost a heroic effort, but less of an effort than defeating Nazism or less than defeating communism, so it can be done. In that case, we'll probably hold the global warming to maybe 2 or 3 degrees, and that will cause a lot of damage. I mean, global warming is already causing a lot of damage, but it'll be tolerable. Now, the worst case is that the sensitivity is 4 degrees and that people don't live up to their Paris agreements and they don't ratchet it up so that we continue with business as usual, which is frankly what looks like it's likely. And that means we get up by late in the century to 4 degrees, 5 degrees, 6 degrees. It's very bad. You have like 1 billion refugees from areas where the heat waves make them uninhabitable, and because the seas are rising, coastal cities are lost. Meanwhile, agriculture and fishing tanks, you can't grow crops as well. The seas basically die off, not just because of the heat, but because they become more acidic from all the carbon dioxide that they dissolve. So we have billions of people starving. Under those circumstances, it's not clear that democracy can survive. It's not even clear whether our modern civilization can survive. I don't think that the human race will die out. We're very tough, but nothing like the civilization that we now enjoy.
I know the West Antarctic ice sheet is pretty much unstoppable.
Yeah, that's part of the worst scenarios. The West Antarctic ice sheet gives way so that the sea level rises by a couple meters by the end of the century. It's entirely possible, and then much more beyond that. We may already have lost Greenland, but that'll mean 1,000 years from now that the sea level is 20, 30 feet higher. That takes a while to melt that much ice.
The question is the timeline.
Exactly. We're not sure about the whole West Antarctic ice sheet. Parts of it, it's already irreversible, but whether the whole thing will go partly depends on how much greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere.
On that note, do you think that an increased awareness of the catastrophic dangers of climate change and ocean acidification has played a role in softening resistance to the supposed dangers of nuclear power within the environmental movement?
Well, that a number of people who formerly opposed the nuclear reactors have changed their minds and now say that we need all of the above. And I haven't read of anybody who's changed their mind in the opposite direction. As for the public at large, like it or not, the public opinion is pretty stable. Worries about climate change have risen somewhat, especially outside the United States, less so in the United States. Worries about nuclear energy and opposition to nuclear reactors have been pretty stable. They have not fallen as you would expect. And the reason for that is that people see nuclear reactors as an immediate thing, and for better or for worse, they see climate change as something that's more a worry for distant peoples and future generations.
Well, I'll tell you, I've studied global warming and ocean acidification quite a bit as a layman. I find it quite frightening, and that's what's motivated me to start this podcast. You know, you could tell me nuclear power is good, and I'll say, okay, great, but I won't do anything about it if it wasn't for the fact that the fate of the planet was at stake. And then it starts getting very personal. That's the future of my children.
Yeah, when I wrote the books on nuclear fear, part of the motivation was the recognition that reactors are so much better for our health and environment than coal, because at that time coal was rising. Now coal is on the decline, so it's clear that the dominant argument is the climate change. And that was one of the reasons I wrote the books in the first place, but now it's become even more important than the superiority of nuclear energy over coal. Although I must say I just came back from India, and I can't speak very highly of the effects of coal when you can't see down the street 3 blocks.
So how do we best overcome the fear of radiation among the general population?
It's going to be difficult, and the fear doesn't just lead to opposition to nuclear reactors. It also, doctors are concerned that people who would benefit from radiation therapy choose some other kind of therapy because they're too afraid of radiation. It's going to be very difficult, and I don't think you will ever entirely overcome it because these old things are still being propagated. The Simpsons, the computer games, Fallout. So it's very difficult to oppose, but we do have one advantage, and that is that the really visceral fear that the early generation, and I mean my generation, the ones who grew up with duck and cover drills in the corridors in the schools and so forth, nuclear warfare is no longer present in the current younger generation. The fact of the matter is it should be, because there's still thousands of nuclear weapons that ready to be launched on 20 minutes warning, but they don't have that kind of fears that people had, and consequently there isn't the same kind of a spillover of deep psychological horror and so forth. The giant radioactive monsters, the huge ants and Godzilla and so forth that went through the movies in the 1950s, the modern generation just looks at it as kind of ironic. They don't find it so horrific. So the deep psychological things are less present now, but it's not much that we can do about it. It's just something that's happening.
Do you see any difference in the U.S. and European nuclear fears and their history?
They're pretty similar. The anti-nuclear reactor movement began in the United States in the 1960s, at a time when most cultural things began in the United States. It spread pretty quickly to Europe. And I'd say the main difference is because of the way European countries are set up, the politicization became more extreme. There were larger anti-nuclear, anti-reactor demonstrations. There are more parties there, so parties on the left could take up anti-nuclear reactor much more strongly than either of the American parties could do so. And of course we see this, the consequence after Fukushima, both Italy and Germany essentially closed down their plans for nuclear reactors, whereas in the United States, nothing like that has happened.
How much would you say has nuclear fear played a role in terms of what some might call overregulation?
Well, there's no question that the nuclear industry has been very heavily regulated, and that a lot of this regulation has been due to public pressure, very strong public pressure, both in public demonstrations and in court cases. So that has led to a very strict regulatory regime. And it's been unfortunate in a way. It's not really a question of the overregulation of the nuclear industry as the underregulation of other industries. The reason we're afraid of radiation is because radioactive substances cause cancer and genetic mutations. But many other things do that, and the coal industry emits these things, radioactive substances themselves in large quantities, and things like strychnine, many organic chemicals that are very dangerous to the health, and they don't carefully store them and put them underground like the nuclear reactors do. They emit them into the atmosphere. They pile them up on the surface where they get into the water supply. So if things were on an equal basis, and if industries were required to be equally clean, coal and fossil fuel industries in general would be much more highly regulated, and probably as a matter of equity, nuclear industry less so. The reason, of course, that the nuclear industry is so highly regulated is because it has this long history of people associating radiation with all kinds of horrible things, most notably nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and I would say too that given the power of the fossil fuel industry, that it's relatively easy to regulate their competition, but don't touch them.
Yeah, but it was the new kid on the block, so people were able to put the screws on it.
Both the opposition within the lay community to nuclear power and climate change denialism have the same roots in public mistrust of scientific consensuses of all sorts, and the widespread belief that we know better than the experts. That seems to be a thread running through all denialist thinking, whether it be concerning man-made climate change, radiophobia, or other things. Would you speak to that?
Yeah, this is a widespread problem in modern life, is the increasing distrust of every elite. It probably began with the First World War and the Second World War, which kind of proved that the elites didn't have a good grasp on things. And then the arms race made people still further suspicious of their leaders. And then nuclear debates played a very substantial role in this. But it's become even worse in more recent times. People are probably rightly suspicious of the ability of elites to manage the economy. Not because the economy isn't growing, but because for the last 20 or 30 years, all the growth has gone to the top 10% or even the top 1%, so that ordinary people are really struggling. So that makes them suspicious. And then in the United States in particular, things like the Vietnam War and the Iraq War and the ongoing Afghanistan War have made people wonder entirely about the competence of their leadership. No, this has spread to all fields. Scientists are actually still more highly respected than people in most other fields, but they've been caught up in this general thing. Now, in the nuclear area, some distrust of scientists was spread deliberately by people who wanted to slow down the arms race and attack people like Edward Teller and so on, who were advocates of building up nuclear weapons and even the Star Wars missile defense and so on. They got people to spend tens of billions of dollars on fantasies. And in the climate area, it came not from the left, but from the right, when propagandists of the fossil fuel industries, when they lost the scientific argument, took to ad hominem arguments against the climate scientists themselves. So it's been deliberately promoted in both areas. There's basically two reasons why people do and should trust scientists more than other people. In the first place, scientists genuinely are dedicated to finding the truth. If you want power or money, believe me, you don't become a research scientist. There's better ways to do that. So they're dedicated to finding things out, and they are trained to not fool themselves. When a scientist thinks they've found something, they go through every possible effort to find out where they might be wrong. Scientists, like everybody else, do sometimes fool themselves, and so they've built up a community to check one another. They've spent 300 years, and they're still working on ways to make sure that what other scientists say is correct. If you find that the National Academy of Sciences issued a committee report saying that we're quite sure of such and such, you can be sure that they have appointed people very carefully, people who represent all points of view, very knowledgeable and expert people. And these people have spent weeks or sometimes months arguing with each other. They've done it on the basis of hundreds of papers published in peer-reviewed journals, papers that themselves have been argued over. Often, papers that turn out to be very important have been submitted to a journal, and then they've had months of arguing with the referees about what they can and cannot properly say. So there's this great engine of verification that lies behind all scientific findings. Very often scientists will say, well, I think this is so, but I'm not sure. We don't have enough evidence for it. And that doesn't always show up in the media. So people in the media quote scientists as if they were very sure of something, and then it turns out they were wrong. And the scientists may have told the reporter, well, I know this might be wrong, but that doesn't get through. So it tends to make people be a little suspicious of things that they see.
I can say this about when I was at Fermilab many years ago. I met a whole lot of the theoretical and experimental physicists out there, and these were not the guys who went into it for the money. These were not the guys living in McMansions. I can tell you, they're not bought off. They're doing it because they love it. They love it.
There was an article in The Guardian about research scientists living out of their cars.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
I can see that.
Could our public education system play a role in counteracting the hysteria over radiation?
Well, yes and no. We know that giving people facts doesn't take you very far. It's not because they don't know the facts that people are afraid of a lot of these things. But we do necessarily, some people are able to grasp the facts and use them to guide themselves, so we want to reach at least those children. And it's important to teach children not just the facts of radiation, but more important, how to do risk analysis in general. Children ought to be taught not just what the relative dangers of different things are, but also of the cognitive problems that keep human beings from judging facts and risks accurately. That they see an accident that kills 100 people, and they're much more worried about that than 1,000 accidents that kill one person each, and all these other things that are mysterious and that seems out of our control, like radiation perhaps, are much more fearful than things that we think we do have control over, like driving a car, although we may not have as much control there as we like to think. So children need to be taught not just the facts of risks, but more important, how to evaluate and compare different risks. And that would certainly help, and it's just an important thing in our technological society in general.
Yeah, as a former public school teacher, I would make one observation to take that a little further. I think that there is really a paucity of understanding of science and understanding of logic, and in both its formal and informal sense. People don't know the difference between a mean on an average and a mode, and those things are important. The little things like that, understanding what an ad hominem is, an appeal to authority, all these kinds of things that are involved in thought.
I agree with you. These things are hard to measure on tests, unfortunately, but it's far less important to teach people facts. What people need to especially learn is how to think.
How do you feel about the future going forward?
We really don't know. On the one hand, things could easily crash even before the end of this century. We know that the Earth can sustain maybe 2 billion people in a modern, advanced lifestyle without any harm to the environment. But within our lifetimes, there's going to be 10 billion people, all of whom are going to want a modern lifestyle but don't have it. There are great possibilities in technology, artificial intelligence, genetic editing, understanding our own brains better. There's enormous things that are happening in science and happening very rapidly. And these are the only things that are going to save us. Present technologies and present political systems aren't going to save us. We have to have new, more democratic political systems in which people are given better control over politics. They're better informed, and they are better able to make sure that their representatives do what they want to have done. And we have to have the science and the research that will give us new and better technologies. These things are doable, but I don't think there's anybody who can say whether or not they will be done. At some point, 10,000 years from now, there's going to be a planet with people on it, probably living in a reasonably good advanced lifestyle. The question is, do we get from here to there through a easy, smooth transition, or do we get there through crashes and bumps and all kinds of things?
We'd like to thank you for being on the podcast, Dr. Weart.
Really enjoyed this. I want to thank you for coming on.
Okay, it's been my pleasure.
And now for our final thoughts. In 1945, the first atomic bomb test created a world of both promise and dread. Robert Oppenheimer famously described that day best by quoting a piece from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was as if with the touch of a button, scientists had arisen from mere mortals to playing God.
Modern science has thus placed itself in the role of the sorcerer's apprentice. We have entered the atomic age, yet our hearts remain in the Stone Age. And so it is that we are placed in the uncomfortable dilemma of having to trust that same scientific priesthood as it continues to clean up the mess of its own making.
It is no wonder that apprehension and even fear and rejection of science have become the norm. And yet we must never forget that the story does end happily when the sorcerer arrives to save the day. Ultimately, it is only through the advancement of science and the pursuit of peace and international cooperation that we can gain the maturity to take on that role and truly wield that magic wand to emerge into a safer, more verdant and peaceful world. We are standing at the crossroads. The power to be that sorcerer is within our hands. But if we fail to rise above our fear, we will drown in a sea of ignorance.
And that's it for our show today. If you have any comments, criticisms, or suggestions, feel free to email us at ecomodernistpodcast@gmail.com.
This is Gabe Ignetti.
And this is Eric Schmitz.
We'll be leaving you till next time.